How can we redesign military decision-making for the 21st century? What are the most effective ways to adhere to military protocols while pushing innovation? And what is the mission of the Strategic Innovation Group within U.S. Space Command? I'll explore these questions and so much more with our very special guest, Dr. Ben Zweibelson, Director of the Strategic Innovation Group at the U.S. Space Command, and author of Beyond the Pale, Designing Military Decision-Making Anew. So, Ben, what is the mission of U.S. Space Command and its Strategic Innovation Group? How does it work to support the overall mission of the U.S. Department of Defense?
Okay, well, so for our audience, I think a lot of them suffer from a very common misunderstanding of what United States Space Command is versus United States Space Force. And so the difference here, just to lay these out to the audience, is military services are the ones, the Army, the Air Force, the Navy, the Marine Corps, but also the United States Space Force. The services provide the people, the training, the equipment, the systems, the stuff, right? However, it's the combatant commands in the United States Department of Defense, and those are geographical, with two exceptions. Those are geographical combatant commands. They're responsible for a large chunk of geographic space, and then they have within them all of the services. There's Air Force and Army and naval assets. So when I was serving in the United States Army, my first overseas assignment was in the 173rd Airborne Brigade in Vicenza, Italy, which is a magnificent place to be assigned. My Army unit fell underneath United States European Command, right? That combatant commander, if something happened, he could use or she could use those forces or transfer them to another combatant command, like what happened with the Iraqi invasion. We were transferred to U.S. CENTCOM. That's another combatant command, Central Command. And so those forces then were used there. Now, back to Space Force and SPACECOM. Our commander is responsible for the entire astro-global plane, which is space, so to speak, from about 100 kilometers up, which is where air turns into space, and out to infinity. But I caveat that with saying really out to the interests and strategic reach of the United States government, right? So that's really out to, essentially the moon, right? So we're talking cislunar. So cislunar space is everything around the Earth, and then everything, all the space that's also all the way out to the moon that's in orbit around us, which is a lot. It's much, much, much bigger. So the United States Space Command, our commander is responsible for a much, much bigger space, but there's only a couple of people that are in the space domain right now. That's on the International Space Station, right? So there's very, very few people, very few humans in the domain, but there's a lot of stuff and there's a lot of things going on. There's a lot of things that go through space to the ground, from the ground up to space, and then space is utilized in a many, many different ways that are very important to commerce, industry, academia, exploration, but also security.
Perhaps, Ben, you share with us, what is design thinking? Maybe break down some of the core principles, concepts, and how has the use of design thinking in the military context evolved over the years?
All right, so that is the focus of my first book, which is through Rutledge, and that book is titled Understanding the Military Design Movement, and it's basically my dissertation, all the work I did for my doctorate. It's sort of like creativity and innovation and leadership. You were to say, what is the catch-all definition? I think one of them, it comes from a designer, Buchanan, in 1992. And he essentially said, design is about bringing into the world that which does not yet exist. It could be a thing, it could be an idea, it could be anything, but it's needed by the organization today. So you have to design it in. And Russell Ackoff talked about problem dissolution a little bit earlier, and Horst Riddle is another great design philosopher and thinker about this. When you design, you're not planning, although planners will use design deliverables, because a designer is creating something that doesn't exist yet, but it's going to propel society or the organization or whatever group or client you're working for into some sort of advantage that's disruptive to the legacy system, the way that things are now. So smartphones are a great example. When the engineers were creating smartphones, they understood that they were going to make something that's not what the phones were up until that point, but they didn't understand all the things that were going to spiral out from smartphones and how smartphones have really changed how we ours as a civilization. It is truly, on so many levels, transformed us in ways that are way, way outside of the scope of the original engineers thinking about this, right? So the split between commercial design and military design is a very interesting one. I get into this in my first chapter of that book, Understanding the Military Design Movement. A bunch of people came out of World War II in the area, and then that got exported to Stanford and to Berkeley, California, and then boom, you've got these amazing designs, groups and movements and methods all developing in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then it got commercialized. And then in the 80s and 90s, you've got the D School, and you've got all these different kind of programs and institutions and brandings, and that brings us to modern day. Now, the military design movement took a very, very twisted path. So in the late 1990s, Shimonave and a think tank called OTRI, O-T-R-I, they were basically tasked by the Israeli Defense Force to come up with new ways of applying creativity, innovation for the military in a military context, a war context. And that's where systemic operational design, the very first military design, came from. And it was a combination of complexity theory, general systems theory, and mathematics. It was coming from postmodernism, critical theory, multiple paradigms, all this stuff that you couldn't get. And it promptly got shot in the face because the military institution didn't want any of that stuff. It just wanted the planning stuff to work a little bit better. So then you go through multiple decades now of forces, Americans, Canadians, Europeans, Australians, struggling with, well, do we want design? And if we do, how do we want it? And it's too disruptive. Tone it down. Put it in doctrine. No. Get a small cell. Have them do this crazy stuff, but then keep them away from everyone else. And that becomes a significant tension that's still unfolding today with how military design as a small minority movement, if you will, within the defense industry and defense institution on how they're dealing with change.
I want to switch gears, Ben, to your current, I think it's one of your latest books. It's Beyond the Pale.
Yes.
You challenge, which you've articulated throughout our conversation, some of the conventional military decision-making processes. I was wondering what inspired you to delve into this subject and write the book?
Great question, Michael. I think this is part of that military design culture is that we are, when you fall into kind of that design community, most people fall into it by accident. They're going about their daily business. They're doing their job. And this happens everywhere. This happens in every industry. So people join design movements, I think, including in the Department of Defense and military organizations. The military design movement, though, is trying to help the military in productive ways, as well as help government, help industry, help academia. It's trying to modernize and develop and increase and improve. And all this deals towards not increasing being better at war. It's looking at how do we address war differently? How do we address conflict differently? Is there a way that you could have conflicts resolved without war? That's something that's aspirational, but that's something that everybody should be thinking about. So the design movement, though, tries different directions, thinking about futures differently, thinking about language, thinking about methods, thinking about the models, and whether or not the ones that we're currently using that we love, that we identify with, that gives us purpose and meaning, they might not be the right ones now as they were before. And how do you change that in a productive, healthy way that doesn't cause the institution to lash back at you?
You point out in some of your writings that, AI cognition speed, weapon sophistication increases at a rate that we haven't seen. And what we're seeing now is human operators are increasingly falling off the loop. I was hoping you could tell us more about the implications in this situation. Are there any guardrails, Ben, to be instituted to mitigate the effects of this reality? And how can we prepare the warfighters and the public at large for this new reality?
I've written about, I think, 4 or 5 articles, and some of them are lengthy, and there's a lot of citations, so I apologize in advance. But if listeners go over to the Marine Corps University Press, there's this Journal of Advanced Military Studies, or JAMS. They've got a couple of my articles, and then the Marine Corps University Press also has a different element that does more of a digital-facing, longer piece. And so that one is up. It's called Phantasmal, A War Becoming Phantasmal. That really goes off the deep end. So if folks are excited about some of the deep philosophical stuff, they might want to hit War Becoming Phantasmal. or the other one, which is Breaking the Newtonian Fetish, which is in the latest issue of JAMS. But there's two earlier articles that came out in 2023 at the JAMS site in their last journal. And one was called Whale Songs of Wars Yet Not Waged, or Future Wars Not Yet Waged, something like that. And that deals with the Elon Musk famous line where he said that future AI will be so fast and so sophisticated and so exquisite that when humans are typing or talking to them, we are going to sound like slow whale song, and they're just going to be so much faster, which is an important point. But the other article that I would love interested listeners to go check out is called the Singleton Paradox, and this works off of Nick Bostrom's work, who's a Swedish scientist and philosopher and thinker about artificial intelligence. He's the one who coined the concept singleton, and then my writings, I basically do a treatment of this into it, paralleling it to nuclear arms race. What a singleton is an entity, and we'll keep it just an AI, artificial intelligence, is if you go from artificial or narrow AI, which is all that we have right now, no matter how good you think chatbot is, it's still narrow AI, just like Deep Blue, right? And Deep Blue was incredibly good at winning at Jeopardy. And then I believe it's won at Go, it beat the best Go players, and all these things are happening where it's like, wow, this is so amazing. What's important there is that when we start talking about narrow AI, what's next? General intelligence, AGI. This is artificial general intelligence, is theoretical. It doesn't exist yet. But if and when it does, and people like Elon Musk are saying it's going to be around within a year or two, I think Bostrom's original treatment of this is a little bit out of date, but it's still pretty accurate, was that there's a 10% chance of it being available by 2030 and a 90% chance of it being available by 2090. I think that's about right. I think by 2030, AGI is probably quite realistic, if not maybe a year or two earlier. And what is AGI? That is where the AI can equal or exceed any human in any measurable, useful cognitive task without any adjustments. It just will be able to do it. This means more than just mathematics. This means more than writing your term paper, although it will do that, which is a whole problem for our academic programs. It has to do with poetry. It has to do with determining a better way of routing air conditioning. It has to do with reconfiguring how naval carrier groups refuel. It has to do with attempting to solve world hunger, brain surgery, making movies, writing plays, producing music. AGI will equal or exceed the best of us. And what's really scary is that at a certain point, as soon as artificial intelligence can meet or exceed our best and brightest abilities, right? So we're talking an average IQ of around 180, right? So that's sort of where Einstein and Newton and several others were at. Well, what is going to stop it from going to 200 to 250 to 500 to 1,000? The scale breaks for us because we just don't know what that is, because we have no understanding of that. And then how would we be able to detect it? And how do we know we were being told the truth? And this is some of the stuff that Bostrom talks about. But a singleton would be something that's so vastly intelligent, that's so exquisite, and in a meaningful way. Like if it says, I'm going to create a new drug that will cure cancer, and then it prints it out and it works. Like that's the level of AGI that we're talking about. And it sounds science fiction. But the reality is that once you go past the greatest and brightest of humans and you enter into AGI territory, the hypothetical is staggering and also terrifying. Now, a singleton would be something that a government or a group of people, after being sophisticatedly demonstrated and convinced, you would then give this entity control of everything, control of government, control of security. Right now, I know everyone's saying war games. We've seen this. Skynet, right? Here's the problem with those Hollywood tropes. And this is the problem with human imagination in general, is that most science fiction is a social mirror or commentary of our times, right? Well, Who are the people that are writing these stories? It reflects the times, because science fiction is not really about the future. It's about a fantasization of a different way that humanity could be, that's wrapped in this layer of technology and magical stuff that's really cool, like light speed and robots and Wookiees. The challenge, though, is that Skynet's always defeated by the plucky human protagonists. Sarah Connor always triumphs, right? That isn't how things will unfold with a Singleton, because the Singleton is going to be so much more smarter than us, we actually won't be able to outthink it. And so then the challenge becomes, well, how do you contain and control and properly manage something that's smarter than you? And it's very, very difficult. It's still theoretical, but this is a true security concern that's rapidly approaching. Now, add this to the arms race factor. When the atomic weapons were used on Japan in 1945, it was just a matter of time until other nations would go and develop their own super weapons. And it did happen. And there's two forks that could have occurred from 1945. One, which I'm glad didn't happen, was that every nation that would develop nuclear weapons, right? The other one was that, well, to the best of the international community's abilities, and this is broken up into, at that point, the Cold War, you had a communist, Marxist, and then you had a capitalist, liberalist, democratic division. And then you also had the industrialized world and the unindustrialized world. But you ended up having basically a balancing. All right. And that's how nuclear weapons and the development of them have generally progressed. What will happen with Singletons? Because if one country or one university or one company develops AGI, then what? Because one of the things that Bostrom talks about with Singletons is that Singletons don't like other Singletons. They represent an existential threat to themselves. And the element of the nuclear bomb is that even as horrific as the nuclear age is, a nuclear bomb designed by humans does what it's designed for and is only able to do what its users, which are human, direct it to do. Nuclear bomb doesn't just suddenly decide, I want to do poetry instead. It exists to do what it was designed. It is a weapon with the ends that justifies the means that the humans created it for, as all weapons are, going back to the stirrup on the first horse 2,000 years ago. AGI will be different, and that is a profound change for civilization and for war, because AGI will be the first weapon that can change its own ends beyond that of the original aspirations of the human designers and to a new ends that may not be comprehensible by those human designers. That's shocking.
This has been the Business of Government Hour, a conversation with Dr. Ben Zweibelson, Director of the Strategic Innovation Group at the U.S. Space Command and author of Beyond the Pale, Designing Military Decision-Making Anew. Be sure to join us next time for another informative, insightful, and in-depth conversation on improving government leadership and its effectiveness. Until then, subscribe, download, and listen to the entire interview at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Audible, or on your favorite podcast app, and as always at businessofgovernment.org.